Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at kind of a tale of two nations,
Right.
Kenya and Singapore,
Okay.
two countries that started out
Yeah.
in pretty similar circumstances, but their paths diverged.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to see how these two nations, despite, kind of starting from relatively similar positions as British trading hubs, have charted such
Right.
dramatically different.
Yeah, they're like two ships that sailed from the same port and ended up in completely different parts of the world.
Totally.
So let's set the stage a little bit here.
Okay.
Both countries were strategically positioned for trade.
Right.
Singapore, at the heart of the Strait of Malacca,
Yes.
became a vital link in that global shipping network. Kenya, on the other hand,
Yeah.
sat at the crossroads of ancient trade routes spanning Africa, Asia, and Europe.
And those early trading connections, I think, had a lasting impact on their development trajectories.
Yeah, for sure.
Singapore, with its limited natural resources, had to really rely on its strategic location and its people to create wealth.
Yeah, they had no other choice.
Right.
Kenya had abundant natural resources.
Yes, fertile land, diverse wildlife.
All that good stuff.
Yeah.
But as we'll see, those blessings didn't always translate
Doesn't always pan out.
into economic prosperity.
Right.
So let's fast forward to the 1960s,
Okay.
a pivotal decade for both nations.
Yeah.
Singapore, facing high unemployment after separating from Malaysia in 1965, went all in on labor-intensive industrialization.
They did.
They literally transformed a mangrove swamp into the bustling Jurong industrial estate, churning out textiles, toys, and electronics for the global market.
It was a really bold move,
It was.
but it paid off big time.
Yeah.
Singapore's economy boomed,
Yeah.
and they quickly became a major manufacturing hub.
Yeah, one of the fastest growing economies in the world at that point.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, Kenya, gaining independence in 1963, took a different route,
Mm.
prioritizing the Africanization of their economy. Essentially, they wanted to regain control of their resources and industries after decades of colonial rule.
Makes sense.
Yeah, trying to right some of those historical wrongs.
Right.
So that meant transferring ownership
Yeah.
from British companies to Kenyan citizens.
Right.
The goal was to create a more equitable and independent economy.
And it's interesting because it had like a mixed bag of results.
Yeah, they work.
On the one hand, it did lead to a sense of national pride and ownership,
Sure.
after decades of being under colonial rule.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it also created some economic challenges.
Yeah. What kind of challenges?
Well, some of the newly appointed Kenyan leaders didn't really have the experience or expertise to run these complex businesses.
Makes sense.
It's a steep learning curve.
Yeah. So while Singapore was focused on building a globally competitive economy,
Right.
Kenya was more inward-looking, trying to establish economic independence after colonialism.
Yeah. And those different priorities, I think, had a big impact on their economic trajectories.
Absolutely. And so Singapore, with its lack of natural resources,
Right.
made a strategic decision to invest heavily in human capital.
Mm-hmm.
They knew that their people were their greatest asset.
Exactly. And they put their money where their mouth was.
Yeah.
They poured resources into education,
Yeah.
training, and healthcare,
Right.
creating a highly skilled and productive workforce.
It's like they were building a nation of entrepreneurs and innovators.
Totally. And that investment paid off handsomely.
It seems like it.
As Singapore transitioned from labor-intensive to capital-intensive industries in the 1980s, they had a workforce ready to embrace the new technologies and opportunities.
Yeah.
They were ahead of the curve
Yeah.
in many ways.
Meanwhile, Kenya struggled to keep pace.
Yeah.
They continued to rely heavily on agriculture, which,
Yeah.
while important, wasn't enough to drive the kind of economic growth they were hoping for.
It's hard to compete on a global scale when you're primarily focused on agriculture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they also faced political instability,
Right.
which discouraged foreign investment
Of course.
and hampered their economic progress.
It creates uncertainty,
Yes.
which is never good for business
Sure.
or for investment.
So let's talk more about Singapore's economic transformation.
Okay.
They seem to really hit their stride in the late 1960s and early 1970s.
Yeah, that's when things really started to take off.
What happened during that period?
Well, Singapore, under the leadership of Lee Kuan Yew,
Uh-huh.
implemented a series of bold economic policies that would transform the nation.
Give me some examples.
Well, they focused on creating value-added industries, moving up the value chain, and promoting research and development.
So it's like that had a blueprint for success.
In a way, they did.
Yeah.
One of their key strategies was to attract multinational corporations
Right?
by offering them tax breaks, a well-educated workforce, and a stable political environment.
And it worked.
It did.
Companies like Hewlett-Packard, Texas Instruments, and Seagate flocked to Singapore,
Yeah.
bringing with them jobs, technology, and investment.
Exactly. It was a win-win situation.
It's incredible how they managed to attract these global giants.
It really is.
What was their secret?
Well, part of it was their relentless focus on efficiency and good governance.
Uh-huh.
They streamlined bureaucracy, cracked down on corruption,
Yeah.
and created a business-friendly environment that was second to none.
So they really made it easy to do business in Singapore.
Absolutely. They wanted to make it as attractive as possible.
And they also invested heavily in infrastructure,
Right.
building world-class ports, airports, and telecommunications networks.
Yes, they understood that infrastructure was key to attracting investment and facilitating trade.
So it's like they were creating the perfect ecosystem for businesses to thrive.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about attracting foreign investment.
Right.
They also nurtured local entrepreneurship, providing support and funding for small and medium-sized enterprises.
They wanted to create a dynamic and diverse economy.
Yes, they knew that they couldn't rely solely on foreign investment.
I'm particularly intrigued by the story of the Singapore River.
Oh yeah, the Dead Chicken River.
You mentioned earlier how it was known as the Dead Chicken River back in the 1970s
Right.
because of all the poultry farms along its banks.
It was heavily polluted
Yeah.
and considered an eyesore.
But the government, recognizing the river's potential, launched a massive cleanup and redevelopment project.
That's right. They relocated the polluting industries, cleaned up the water, and transformed the riverbanks into a vibrant waterfront promenade lined with shops, restaurants, and cultural attractions.
Wow.
It's a remarkable transformation.
It's a powerful symbol of Singapore's transformation from a polluted backwater to a gleaming metropolis.
And it also highlights their long-term vision.
Right.
They weren't just thinking about immediate economic gains. They were thinking about the kind of city they wanted to create for future generations.
That's impressive.
It is.
Now turning our attention back to Kenya. Their journey has been marked by both triumphs and tribulations.
Yeah, it's been a bit of a roller coaster ride.
They had a strong start after independence,
They
with
did.
ambitious plans for economic development.
Right. They implemented policies aimed at promoting industrialization and modernizing agriculture.
Yeah.
They also invested heavily in education and healthcare.
So they were making progress on multiple fronts.
Yes, they were making significant strides in improving literacy rates and life expectancy.
But then things started to go wrong in the 1980s and 1990s, didn't they?
Yes, they faced a number of challenges during that period.
Like what?
Well, political instability, corruption,
Yeah.
and a decline in global commodity prices.
Right, so a combination of internal and external factors.
Exactly.
They also had to deal with the structural adjustment programs imposed by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, which,
Mm.
while intended to help,
Right.
often had negative consequences for their economy.
They were controversial, to say the least.
And those challenges were reflected in their fluctuating GDP growth rates.
Yeah, there were periods of growth, but they were often followed by periods of stagnation or even decline.
So it was hard to maintain momentum.
Right, it was a very unpredictable economic environment.
It's interesting to note that despite those challenges,
Yeah,
Kenya has shown resilience
they have.
and a commitment to economic reform.
Yes.
In the late 1990s and early 2000s,
Hmm.
they implemented measures to improve governance,
Right.
enhance transparency in government procurement,
Yeah.
and reduce the government payroll.
So they were trying to address some of the root causes of their economic problems.
Those seem like positive steps.
They were definitely steps in the right direction.
They also launched ambitious development plans like Vision 2030
Yes.
and the Big Four agenda,
Right.
focusing on key sectors like agriculture, manufacturing, universal healthcare, and affordable housing.
It shows that they're thinking long-term
Right.
and trying to create a more inclusive and sustainable economy.
It sounds like they're trying to learn from their past mistakes and chart a new course for the future.
I think that's a fair assessment.
Of course, comparing the economies of Kenya and Singapore today, is a bit like comparing apples and oranges.
It is. They're at very different stages of development.
That's true.
Singapore boasts one of the world's most competitive financial sectors
Yeah.
and a thriving knowledge-based economy.
Mm-hmm.
They've cemented their position as a global hub for innovation,
Yeah.
attracting multinational corporations and fostering a culture of entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
Their GDP per capita is significantly higher than Kenya's,
Right.
reflecting the difference in their economic structure.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Kenya, on the other hand, is East Africa's financial services hub
Mm-hmm.
and has a strong agricultural sector,
Right.
but they still face issues like corruption, inequality, and a lack of diversification in their economy.
It's a different set of challenges.
Yes.
But challenges nonetheless.
But despite the challenges, Kenya has shown remarkable progress in recent years.
They have, especially in terms of embracing technology.
Yeah, give me an example.
Well, mobile banking,
Yeah.
particularly through M-Pesa,
Right.
has played a transformative role in driving financial inclusion.
It's a fantastic example of how innovation can address local needs and leapfrog traditional development paths.
It's a real game changer.
It's also a reminder that Kenya has the potential to become a major player in the global economy.
Absolutely.
They have a young and dynamic population,
Right.
a strategic location,
Uh-huh.
and a growing entrepreneurial spirit.
The ingredients are all there.
Yes, it seems like they're at a crossroads.
Yeah, they are.
Will they continue to be held back by their past,
Right.
or will they seize the opportunity to create a brighter future?
That's the big question.
I think that's a great place to pause for now.
Okay.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We have, from their colonial past to their contrasting economic paths.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating journey so far.
It has.
In the next part, we'll delve deeper into the factors that have shaped their divergent trajectories
Okay.
and explore what lessons Kenya can learn from Singapore's success story.
Sounds good.
Stay tuned.
Looking forward to it.
So we've laid out kind of the historical and economic
Right.
groundwork,
Mm-hmm.
but I feel like we need to kind of dig a bit deeper into like why these two countries diverge so much.
Yeah, definitely. I think a crucial difference lies in their political landscapes.
Okay.
You know, Singapore, under Lee Kuan Yew's leadership,
Mm-hmm.
prioritized stability and efficiency almost to like an extreme.
Yeah, and that word extreme is interesting
Yeah.
because Lee Kuan Yew and the People's Action Party were in power for decades.
Right.
Was that necessary for their economic success?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I mean, it's true that their system was often described as authoritarian.
Right.
You know, they certainly limited certain freedoms and political dissent. But given Singapore's vulnerabilities at independence, you know, things like ethnic tensions, lack of resources, even like a communist insurgency,
Yeah.
it's possible that like a firm hand was needed to steer them towards security and development.
So a strong centralized government
Right.
helped them implement
Uh-huh.
these ambitious economic plans quickly and effectively.
Yes.
Kenya's political journey has been much more turbulent.
Right. Yeah. They transitioned from British colonial rule to a multi-party democracy, which, you know, as we mentioned earlier, has experienced periods of both stability and instability.
Right.
And unfortunately, that volatility has impacted their economic progress.
It's hard to build a strong economy
Right.
when you're constantly dealing with that political uncertainty.
Absolutely.
Can you give some specific examples of some of the challenges that Kenya's faced?
Sure. Well, for one, they had to grapple with the legacy of colonialism.
Okay.
You know, the British had created a system that benefited a small elite,
Mm-hmm.
often at the expense of the majority.
Right.
And after independence, there were struggles over things like land redistribution, ethnic representation,
Yeah.
the distribution of resources.
Classic kind of nation-building problem.
Exactly. And these tensions sometimes erupted into violence,
Yeah.
which obviously deterred investment
Of
and
course.
hindered development.
Did the Cold War play a role in Kenya's political landscape?
Oh, absolutely. Both the United States and the Soviet Union were vying for influence in Africa,
Right.
and Kenya was caught in the middle.
Caught between those two superpowers.
Right. And this sometimes led them to make political alliances that weren't necessarily in their best long-term economic interests.
So it seems like both countries, despite their very different approaches to governance,
Mm-hmm.
were grappling with kind of these complexities of the post-colonial world.
Definitely.
How did their political systems adapt to meet the demands of, such a rapidly changing global landscape?
Well, Singapore doubled down on their model of efficient governance and long-term planning.
Yeah.
They continued to invest heavily in education, infrastructure, attracting foreign investment.
Mm-hmm.
They essentially tried to future-proof their economy
Yeah.
by anticipating global trends and positioning themselves to capitalize on them.
So what were the long-term risks they were trying to mitigate?
Well, one of their main concerns was becoming overly reliant on low-cost manufacturing, which was becoming increasingly vulnerable to competition from countries like China.
Right.
So they recognized the need to move up the value chain and transition to a knowledge-based economy.
And how did that play out?
Well, it was a gradual process.
Okay.
They invested heavily in research and development, particularly in areas like electronics, biotechnology, and pharmaceuticals.
So they were really trying to stay ahead of the curve.
Yeah, they knew that they couldn't compete on cost alone, so
No.
they had to focus on innovation and quality.
Okay. And while this was happening in Singapore,
Mm-hmm.
Kenya was dealing with kind of those more fundamental issues of
Yeah.
political
Yeah, yeah,
stability and equitable distribution of resources.
Exactly, and those issues continued to hamper their economic progress.
So did their political systems evolve at all?
Well, Kenya's political scene has seen periods of both positive change and stagnation. They've had peaceful transitions of power.
Which is crucial.
It's essential for democratic stability.
Absolutely.
And they have implemented some anti-corruption measures. But corruption remains a significant challenge,
Yeah.
hindering investment and eroding public trust.
And you mentioned earlier that Singapore's model has also come under scrutiny.
Yeah, it has.
What are some of those criticisms?
So some argue that Singapore's focus on efficiency and control has come at the expense of individual freedoms and civil liberties.
Interesting.
Yeah, they have strict laws regulating speech assembly and the media.
Mm-hmm.
Others argue that their meritocratic system, while effective in many ways,
Yeah.
can lead to social stratification and inequality.
So it's kind of a trade-off.
Right. It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
Do you think Kenya could learn anything from Singapore's model? Or are the contexts too different?
It's definitely not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Right.
Singapore's success was shaped by a unique set of historical circumstances and a very specific political context.
Yeah.
Kenya needs to find its own path,
Right.
one that reflects its own values, history, and aspirations.
But what stands out to me is that both countries, despite their very different political systems, are facing kind of similar 21st century challenges.
Right. Globalization, technological disruption, climate change.
Exactly. These are forces that are reshaping the world.
They are.
How are these countries adapting or failing to adapt to those forces?
That's the key question, isn't it?
Yeah. How are they preparing their citizens for the jobs of the future? How are they addressing the growing gap between the rich and the poor?
Right.
And how are they balancing economic growth with environmental sustainability?
These are the challenges of our time.
It seems like both Singapore and Kenya are grappling with these issues
They are.
in their own ways.
Yeah, each country has its own strengths and weaknesses.
Singapore, with its long-term planning and investment in education and technology, seems to be ahead of the curve in some respects.
They are. They're investing heavily in research and development, particularly in areas like artificial intelligence and biotechnology.
Right.
They're also trying to create a more inclusive society by addressing issues like income inequality and providing support for the elderly.
So they're trying to spread the benefits of their economic success.
Yeah, they're trying to make sure that no one gets left behind.
And what about Kenya? How are they responding to these global challenges?
Well, Kenya is working to strengthen its democratic institutions, tackle corruption, and create a more equitable society.
Okay.
They're also trying to harness the potential of their youthful population
Right.
and embrace the opportunities presented by technology.
And I'm interested in their efforts to promote digital inclusion.
Yeah.
We talked earlier about M-Pesa.
Right. A huge success story.
Are there other examples of how technology is driving change in Kenya?
Absolutely. There's a vibrant tech startup scene in Nairobi
Okay.
with young entrepreneurs developing innovative solutions in areas like healthcare, education, and agriculture.
Wow. So they're really using technology to kind of leapfrog some of
Yeah.
those traditional development barriers.
Exactly, and creating new opportunities for growth.
It's exciting to see that kind of energy
is.
and innovation.
Yeah, there's a real sense of optimism in Kenya's tech sector.
So it seems like both countries, despite their very different starting points, are moving towards a more nuanced understanding of what it means to be a successful nation.
Yeah, it's not just about GDP anymore.
Right.
It's about creating a society that's fair, just, and sustainable.
Absolutely.
It's about investing in people, protecting the environment, and ensuring that the benefits of progress are shared by all.
I think that's a great point and a good place to shift gears.
Okay.
We've talked about their internal dynamics.
Yeah,
But what about their role on the global stage?
right. They're international relations.
Singapore and Kenya are becoming increasingly active
They are.
in international affairs.
Yeah, let's explore that in more depth.
We left off talking about Kenya and Singapore's increasing presence on the world stage.
Right, how they're kind of stepping onto the global stage.
Yeah, it seems like both countries are punching above their weight in terms of global influence.
It's true. Singapore, despite its small size, has become a major player in global trade and finance.
Yeah, they're active in multilateral organizations like the World Trade Organization. They host major international conferences, and their diplomacy is very highly respected.
Right, they've really earned a reputation for being effective and pragmatic.
And what about Kenya?
Kenya seems to be playing a more prominent role in regional affairs.
Okay.
They've been really key in peacekeeping efforts in Somalia and South Sudan. They're leading voice in the African Union,
Yeah.
and they're attracting increasing amounts of foreign investment.
So it's interesting how they're both using different strategies to achieve their goals on the global stage.
Right?
Singapore is kind of projecting that economic power,
Yeah.
while Kenya is leveraging its regional influence and diplomatic skills.
I think that reflects their different historical trajectories and their current strengths.
Yeah.
Singapore has had decades to build its economic and diplomatic muscle,
Right.
while Kenya is still kind of emerging as a global player.
So it's like they're both playing this game of global diplomacy,
Mm-hmm.
but they're using different pieces on the chessboard.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
And just like in chess, it's not just about the pieces you have, but how you use them.
Right.
Both countries are becoming increasingly adept at navigating, the complexities of global politics and economics.
It seems like they're both recognizing the importance of regional integration as a way to amplify their influence and achieve their goals.
Definitely Singapore is a founding member of ASEAN,
Right.
the Association of Southeast Asian Nations,
Right.
which has become a really powerful force in regional trade and investment.
It's kind of like the European Union in Southeast Asia,
Yeah, you could say that.
promoting economic cooperation and reducing trade barriers.
Exactly.
And Kenya is part of the East African Community, or EAC,
Yes.
which is also working towards greater economic and political integration in East Africa.
Right.
I've read that they're harmonizing trade policies, building cross-border infrastructure,
Yes.
and even considering a common currency.
It's ambitious, but it has the potential to really transform East Africa into a major economic powerhouse.
So it's interesting how these regional blocs are becoming more and more important on the global stage.
Yeah.
It's almost like the world is reorganizing itself
Mm-hmm.
into these regional power centers.
And that's partly driven by the rise of new global powers like China and India.
Right.
The traditional centers of power in the West are no longer the only game in town.
Yeah, that's a multipolar world.
Because
And it's creating both challenges and opportunities for countries like Singapore and Kenya.
Right. They need to be savvy in navigating these shifting alliances and finding their place in this new world order.
And I think that's what makes their story so compelling.
Yeah.
They're both small countries that have managed to punch above their weight on the global stage.
They have. They've done it through strategic partnerships, skillful diplomacy, and by projecting an image of stability and progress.
It's a reminder that in the 21st century, size isn't everything.
Right.
It's about being smart, adaptable, and making the most of your strengths.
Exactly. And it's not just about hard power anymore.
Right.
Military might and economic dominance.
Yeah.
Soft power, the ability to influence others through culture, ideas, and diplomacy is becoming increasingly important.
Yeah, it's like the world is becoming a giant chessboard
Mm-hmm.
where countries are trying to outmaneuver each other
Yeah.
using a combination of hard and soft power.
And countries like Singapore and Kenya, which may not have the same military or economic clout as some of the bigger players, are
Yeah.
realizing that they can still exert influence through their strategic alliances, their diplomatic skills, and their ability to project a positive image on the global stage.
So they're playing a different game.
Yeah.
And they're playing it well.
They are.
Now, before we wrap up, I think it's important to touch on how both countries are tackling some of the key issues facing the world today.
Okay.
We've already talked about their approaches to economic development,
Right.
but what about things like education, healthcare, and climate change?
Those are all crucial issues.
Let's start with education.
Okay.
Both Singapore and Kenya seem to recognize that a highly skilled workforce is essential for success in the global economy.
Absolutely.
But their approaches have been quite different.
Right. Singapore has built a highly centralized education system
Huh?
that's focused on standardized testing and academic achievement.
So it's a very result-oriented system.
It is.
Has it been successful?
It has in terms of producing a highly skilled workforce.
Okay.
But some argue that it's too focused on rote learning and memorization, and that it stifles creativity and critical thinking.
It's like they're producing excellent test takers,
Right.
but not necessarily innovators or problem solvers.
That's one of the criticisms.
Kenya, on the other hand, has a more decentralized education system that's still struggling with issues of access, quality, and relevance.
Right.
They've made progress in expanding access to primary education, but secondary and tertiary education still have a ways to go.
There's definitely room for improvement.
And there's a growing recognition that they need to update their curriculum
Yes.
to meet the demands of that 21st century workforce.
Absolutely. They need to focus on skills like critical thinking,
Uh-huh.
problem solving, digital literacy, and entrepreneurship.
Okay, let's move on to healthcare.
Okay.
How are both countries handling this complex and increasingly expensive issue?
Well, Singapore has a very efficient healthcare system that's often ranked among the best in the world.
Wow.
They've achieved universal health coverage
Okay.
through a combination of mandatory savings,
Oh.
government subsidies, and private insurance.
It sounds like a well-designed system.
It is in many ways.
Are there any drawbacks?
Some argue that it places too much emphasis on individual responsibility
Okay.
and not enough on social solidarity.
Interesting.
Yeah, there are concerns about rising costs and the potential for inequality in access to care.
And what about Kenya? What are the main challenges they face in providing quality healthcare to their population?
Well, Kenya is still working towards achieving universal health coverage.
Right.
They face major challenges in terms of funding, infrastructure, and the availability of qualified medical professionals, particularly in rural areas.
It sounds like they have a lot of work to do.
They do, but there are some bright spots.
Like what?
Well, they've made progress in areas like maternal and child health,
Okay.
and they're starting to see some success with mobile health technology,
Interesting.
which is bringing healthcare to remote areas and making it more affordable.
That's encouraging.
It is.
It seems like both countries are trying to find those innovative solutions to the challenges of providing quality healthcare in
Right.
the 21st century.
Trying to think outside the box.
Now let's talk about climate change, which is perhaps the most pressing issue facing humanity today.
Yeah, it's a global crisis.
Both Singapore and Kenya are vulnerable to the impacts of a changing climate.
Definitely.
Singapore, as an island nation, must be particularly concerned about rising sea levels.
Absolutely. They've invested heavily in coastal defenses,
Okay.
and they're even exploring kind of futuristic solutions like floating cities.
Wow.
It's pretty amazing.
And what about Kenya? How are they dealing with the impacts of climate change?
Kenya is facing challenges like drought desertification and the loss of biodiversity.
Right.
These are serious threats to their agriculture, their water resources, and their overall economy.
It sounds like they're on the front lines of the climate crisis.
They are.
Are they taking it seriously?
They are both. Kenya and Singapore have signed the Paris Agreement
Okay.
and are committed to reducing their carbon emissions.
What specific steps are they taking to achieve those goals?
Well, both countries are investing in renewable energy sources like solar and wind power.
Uh-huh.
Kenya has enormous potential for geothermal energy as well.
Right.
They're also promoting sustainable agriculture, protecting forests, and developing climate-resilient infrastructure.
It's encouraging to see them taking concrete action to address climate change.
It shows that they're committed to creating a more sustainable future.
It seems like both countries, despite their many differences, are demonstrating a commitment to that idea
I agree.
of creating a more sustainable future.
Yeah, they're both trying to find that balance between economic growth and environmental protection.
And I think that's a key takeaway from our deep dive.
What is it?
Singapore and Kenya,
Huh?
despite their contrasting histories, their different political and economic systems,
Yeah.
are both facing the challenges of the 21st century with a sense of urgency and a willingness to innovate.
I think that's a great observation.
They're both on journeys of transformation.
They are.
And it's fascinating to see how those journeys are unfolding.
Yeah, they're finding their own unique paths to progress.
Right?
And in doing so, they're offering valuable lessons for other countries around the world.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up our deep dive
Okay.
into these fascinating worlds of Kenya and Singapore,
Mm-hmm.
what are some of the key takeaways for you?
Well, what stands out to me is their resilience and their adaptability.
Okay.
Despite facing different challenges,
Yeah.
they're both embracing change, experimenting with new ideas, and finding their own unique paths to progress.
Uh-huh.
They also seem to be recognizing that the old models of development,
Okay.
focused solely on economic growth, are no longer sufficient.
Right.
They're starting to see that true progress requires a more holistic approach,
Yeah.
one that takes into account the well-being of their people, the health of their environment,
Right.
and their place in the global community.
I couldn't agree more. They're both on journeys of transformation. And it'll be fascinating to see where those journeys take them in the coming years.
It will.
I think their stories offer valuable lessons for other nations,
Definitely.
regardless of their size, their history, or their level of development. In a world that's constantly changing, the key to success is not to cling to the past,
Right.
but to embrace the future, to experiment, to
Mhm.
innovate, and to never stop learning.
Well said. I think that's a great note to end on.
Yeah.
Their stories are a reminder that even in a world that often seems defined by division and conflict,
Yeah.
there's still hope, there's still opportunity, and there's still the potential for progress.
It's been a truly illuminating deep dive full of insights and surprises.
It has.
To our listeners, we hope this has sparked your curiosity and inspired you to learn more about these fascinating nations and the challenges and opportunities facing the world today. And perhaps, just perhaps, it's also inspired you to think about your own role in shaping a better future.
That would be fantastic.
Until next time,
Yeah.
keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
See you next time.